What's going on, guys? Welcome to episode 47 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Today, Josh and I are going to be going over his most recent newsletter, talking about some additional context that rolls into the discussion surrounding training volume, specifically kind of talking about absolute versus relative changes in training volume and how that may affect the way that we look at training. Just before we get into that, though, obviously, if you enjoy the show and enjoy what we do, go ahead and leave us a 5-star rating review on your podcast viewer of choice. Not even sure which ones people use nowadays, but I think Apple and Spotify are still the main ones. So if you really enjoy it, go ahead and leave a rating on both.
Overcast is the GOAT.
Overcast is the GOAT. Okay, there's
But I'm pretty sure it uses Apple's Spotify or not. I'm pretty sure it uses Apple's or Spotify's actual feed. So I think Apple and Spotify are the only places you can leave reviews. But Overcast is the GOAT. They have this function called Smart Speed, and it basically cuts out when people take a break between speaking, right? So those kind of dull periods, it just cuts them out and saves a bunch of time. There's and then it'll tell you how much time it saved you with the Smart Speeds function, and it's awesome.
How much does it save on average? I'm curious now.
Last time I checked, it was in the 20 something hour range for me, but that's over multiple years.
Right. Interesting. That's cool.
So yeah, you can sign up at a discount in the description.
Yeah, and so we'd like to announce our first sponsor of the show, actually. All right, and before we get rolling too, we've been, as we mentioned, really excited with the feedback that we've gotten on the nutrition course that just recently dropped. By the time this podcast come out, the nutrition course will still be on sale for a few more days. So if you want to get your hands on that, please don't hesitate to do so. There'll be a link in the description to do that. But without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into today's discussion. So Josh, as I said, you recently wrote a newsletter kind of making the claim that there's more to kind of the discussion surrounding training volume than just the number of sets that we perform per week per muscle group. And I think you did a really good job kind of going through a few different lines of evidence here and kind of conceptualizing this concept. So yeah, I'll kick it over to you and you can kind of start things off where you think makes the most sense.
Yeah. If you hear me randomly stop talking in the middle of this, it's probably because I'm coughing. Just spent almost a couple weeks in the Midwest, and my body is not used to being in the Midwest. So I'm fighting a little bit of a cold. And hopefully you have Smart Speed, because if that's the case, then you won't even notice. So yeah, let's go ahead and dive in. No warm-up question today. I think there's going to be a lot to kind of talk about with this study, because it has a lot of interesting and I think important and lastly, potentially overlooked implications. So the study that I reviewed in our most recent newsletter, which by the way, you can sign up for free. You can find the link for that in the description if you're not already signed up. It's actually a study from 2021 that's been talked about a lot. It's definitely not one that's gone under the radar by any means, but it's one that we've probably mentioned in passing a few times on the podcast. It's one that probably mentioned on social media as well here and there. But given we have this new format of the newsletters, I thought it would be good to shed some light on it. And again, some of the important implications I think are there. And it's also a general topic I've been very interested in lately. So again, the study is from Scarpelli and colleagues. And to kind of set the stage for this, when we typically think about training volume, we think of just the absolute training volume, right? What's the best training volume that someone can do? You'll hear the general recommendation of 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week. And the conversation kind of stops there, at least, when you kind of think, when people think about training volume in general. Whereas I think we can think of training volume in slightly different terms, specifically in terms of short-term changes in training volume. So this isn't mutually exclusive from absolute training volume, but instead just another consideration to layer on top of absolute training volume. And again, I think this study provides kind of a proof of concept that there's more to training volume than just the absolute number of sets per week. So I'll try to make this breakdown of the study pretty quick. Obviously, if you want a little bit more detail, check out the newsletter. But hopefully we can provide more of a general discussion on this in the podcast. So the study included 16 subjects, which isn't a huge sample size. However, it was a within subjects design, meaning, as we've talked about on the show before, one leg was randomized to one condition and the other leg was assigned the other condition. The subjects had an average of 5.1 years of training experience, and basically they compared quote unquote individualized volume to standardized volume. So one leg was assigned to, again, at that individualized volume. And what they did is they essentially interviewed the subjects to determine the number of sets that they were performing per week for their quads before the study, right? The few weeks before the study. And then they added 20%, and that's the volume they were assigned for this 8-week study. So if they were doing 15 sets per week before the study for their quads, then they would have added 20% to that, which is 18 sets per week in that individualized volume leg. And then the other leg was assigned a standardized volume, which was 22 sets per week. They came up with this just kind of using like a random sample of studies in the literature. That doesn't really matter. But the point is that one leg in every single subject performed standardized volume of 22 sets per week. The other leg performed 20% above what that individual was doing before the study. The volume was split presumably evenly between leg press and leg extension. And you might be wondering how much volume they actually did in that individualized volume leg. Again, if you check out the newsletter and you look at chart 1, you can kind of see this for each individual. But on average, the individualized legs performed 24 sets per week, which is really a nice coincidence, because what that means is you're basically comparing one condition that did an average of 24 sets per week and another condition performing a standardized 22 sets per week, right? So more or less the same volume, but again, in that individualized volume leg, it was a wide range. So it ranged from I believe it was 12 to 50 sets per week in that individualized volume leg. Now, in terms of the outcomes, if you just kind of pool the two conditions, muscle growth was greater in the individualized volume condition. So cross-sectional area increased 9.9% on average in that individualized volume condition versus 6.2% in that standardized volume condition. The p-value barely crossed zero, barely was below 0.05. But nonetheless, about 50% greater growth in that individualized volume condition. So I think it is something to definitely pique our interest at least. I think things get a little bit more interesting when you look at the individual data. So if you kind of look at the 16 subjects, 10 of those 16 saw more hypertrophy in the individualized volume condition. And they kind of deemed whether something was more or not if it was greater than one typical error of measurement than the other leg, right? If that difference was greater than one typical error of measurement. So 10 of the 16, so more than half of the subjects saw more growth in the individualized volume leg. 2 ended up seeing greater growth in that standardized volume leg. And then 4 saw no difference. So pretty clear kind of results in favor of individualized volume. Okay. So when we kind of introduced this and when I kind of started speaking here, I kind of framed this around short-term changes in training volume. However, this study in and of itself cannot perfectly tell us about short-term changes in training volume. Instead, I think it's just kind of idea fuel for that. And reason being is that this could just be more so along the lines of how important individualization of volume is, right? So for example, say a subject was doing 10 sets per week before the study, just because they found that programs that they ran with kind of, lower-ish volumes around 10 sets per week, they just did a lot better on them. They felt a lot better compared to when they tried higher volume programs with, say, 30 sets per week. So they ended up at 10 sets per week just kind of through intuition. And the fact that they went from 10 to 12 in one leg compared to 10 to 22 in the other leg, that was just a matter of individualization as opposed to some inherent magic of, plus 20% on your volume. So it's hard to totally tell like exactly what's driving this difference. Probably some combination of individualization and these short-term increases in training volume. But I talked about in the newsletter a study from Aube and colleagues that I think is interesting to consider alongside these results. Um, so in this study by Abe, it was a pretty kind of standard volume study. They had three groups: one training with 12 sets per week, one with 18, and one with 24 sets per week of the quads. Um, and what they did is basically among all those subjects, they kind of pulled together all of their results and split them into three groups based on their response from that study. So those that saw the most muscle growth, those that saw the least, and then those that kind of saw the middle amount of muscle growth. And on average, the individuals that had the highest response in that Abe study saw the greatest muscle growth. So if you kind of look at that highest responder group, kind of that they looked at post hoc, they added on average 6.6 sets, whereas those middle responders added 4.3 sets, and the lower responders added 1.8 sets on average. Now, the standard deviations of these are absolutely massive. So the highest responders added 6.6 plus or minus 12.4 sets. So that's basically goes to show that this is just kind of on average, and some people that had the highest response actually decreased volume just based on that massive standard deviation. Now, this study is definitely not experimentally looking at short-term changes in training volume and how that influences outcomes. It was kind of a post hoc analysis of, just kind of seeing what's going on there. And there's a ton of other variables, right? There's just this wasn't a within subjects design, so it could just be that, hey, those really high responders are just going to respond really well to training, no matter what volume group they're assigned to. And also, absolute training volume is going to matter to some degree, right? The actual training volume that they're doing, whether that's a good fit for that individual, is going to matter too. So there's a lot of confounding variables here. So to kind of sum up my general thoughts on this concept of short-term changes in training volume, I would say that whether that kind of variable that I'm proposing, again, of short-term changes in training volume, whether it has an independent effect on training on muscle growth, I don't think we can conclusively determine whether it does or doesn't based on the existing research. But I think there's a good amount of indication that it does, and that also seems to square pretty well with practical experience as well and anecdotes. So now we'll get into the interesting stuff along the lines of application, but I'll pause there now that we've reviewed this study and kind of mentioned the results from Abe and colleagues as well. Zach, see if you have any thoughts, anything you think was unclear. Otherwise, we can dive into the practical application.
Yeah, not really. I think after we've had this study kind of come up in multiple different conversations, it's always leaves a few more things to discuss every time I think we go through it. It's a really good study, and I think it results in some pretty interesting conversation. But I'm not gonna hold us up too much. Let's keep rolling, and then we can kind of get into some of the practical applications.
Sweet. So I think the most obvious or potentially simplest as well application of this concept of short-term changes in training volume is specialization cycles. To some degree, I think there are situations where specialization cycles will have a neutral to positive effect on net hypertrophy in the long run when you start to think about practical considerations as well. So just to make sure we kind of define our terms and just generally overview how I would recommend using these in practice, it would basically be selecting 1 to 4 muscle groups per cycle, training cycle, primarily talking about, mesocycle type length in that 4 to 12 week type range. And basically increasing training volume and leveraging short-term changes in training volume that might have an independent effect, as we've talked about. And then also doing some other things that can help specialize those muscle groups, such as placing them earlier in sessions. And then the rest of your muscles, they can be, volume can be reduced if you want to, or if you need to save some time. They can also just be at the same volume they've been at, right? And then you just kind of bump up 1 to 4 muscles and kind of push those a little bit harder. And again, the reason I mentioned that I think this might be a neutral effect at worst is when you start to think about practical considerations of training, especially someone that seems to respond well to higher volume training. And if you want to leverage the potential benefits of short-term increases in training volume. In the newsletter, I kind of go through an example of someone that maybe is training with 25 sets per muscle group per week. And I'm just like, hey, this becomes a serious time investment. You're looking at least 10 hours of training, probably more like 12 to 14 hours of training per week to do something like that. Let alone, I know a lot of listeners here are strength athletes themselves or uh, coach strength athletes. And, you start thinking about warming up for top sets, waiting for equipment. You're looking at, a ton of time investment in the gym if you start to push, relatively high volumes. Um, so an alternative to that is just to do that for 1 to 4 muscle groups and essentially kind of have training that resembles specialization cycles. Um, so I would recommend checking out table 1 at the end of the newsletter. Kind of has a hopefully intuitive visual of how you can do this, right? Basically, again, pick 1 to 4 muscles per cycle, bump up the volume somewhere in the range of maybe 20 to 40% from what your kind of habitual volume is. And then everything else can stay at what it was before, or it can even go down to say as low as like 50 to 60% of what you were at before. Um, and I just think this is a fun way to train as well. I would say probably half of the lifters I work with do specialization cycles in one form or another. This can be choosing to push squat or deadlift and kind of choosing to focus on one and kind of prioritize it within the week a little bit more, whether that's just exercise order within a session, whether that is, just pushing more volume on that movement or accessories targeting specific strength limiters in that movement for the individual. Or if it's someone that enjoys, you know, strength training as well as physique focused training as well, choosing 1 to 2 kind of physique oriented muscles. Maybe it's lateral delts and biceps, for example. Having a little bit of fun, putting those first in a few sessions and pushing volume a little bit harder on those to potentially, again, leverage these short term increases in training volume and the independent effects they might have on hypertrophy. I think there are some other potential implications here, but again, I think specialization cycles are the one that I have the most experience with and I would kind of vouch for the most. And I think there are some important practical benefits as well. And even if this whole like short-term increases in training volume stuff doesn't work out, I think it's just I have a hard time believing it would be worse in a lot of cases, given some of the research we have on detraining, maintenance volume, etc. So yeah, Zach, what do you think of all that?
No, yeah, it's really good. I think it brings up some questions that I have for you, mostly just based on reading this the most recently. Um, w- so when we look at these studies that kind of look at these short term changes in training volume, do you think do you think that effect lasts kind of throughout a training career? And let's start there, and then I'll have the follow ups after that. But like, what do you think about diminishing returns in terms of short term elevations in training volumes over a career? So if you're an intermediate lifter, you increase your training volume by 20%. That results in meaningfully greater progress. And then kind of what you just mentioned, maybe you put it on the back burner for a little bit and then you come back to that. But now I'm a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years later in my training career. Does that have any sort of diminishing returns?
So would it be fair to characterize your question, or I guess rephrase your question as whether the um, potential benefits of specialization cycles would diminish over time?
Yes.
Yeah. So I actually think specialization cycles in this approach are less likely to result in diminishing returns on your training over the course of, say, 4 months or 12 months than just kind of a steady approach. Um, am I super confident in that? No. But I think it's, again, if I were to, just kind of take a bet, I would definitely make that bet. Um, I think it's pretty clear that we see diminishing returns at a given amount of workload, right? And the question of whether specialization cycles in this general approach can lead to greater net hypertrophy over the course of, again, let's say 1 year, 12 months. Um, it really depends on whether resensitization is a thing or not. We know that it is a thing. We know that once you return to training after some time off, or presumably after significantly reduced training volume, we know that your rate of progress is going to be faster. I think that's pretty clear based on the research we have now. But we don't necessarily have research to indicate that that rate of progress would be so much faster that you would actually end up at a net greater point, right? So again, going back to what I was saying, I think for a lot of people, specialization cycles will be a neutral net effect in the long term at worst, is because I think we have pretty clear proof of concept that that would be the case in the research. But again, I'm not sure if that would lead to um, better or just the same uh, net results in the long term. Um, it definitely could lead to net worse results. It's hard to say for sure. But again, if I had to kind of hedge my bets one way or the other, I would say that specialization cycles probably are less likely to result in those really diminished returns in the long term that we see with highly advanced lifters. Um, I observe it quite frequently that, okay, let's put X muscle group first in a session. We're going to train it 3 times a week. We're going to push volume about as high as you can recover from and see what happens. And that seems to turn out pretty well. Now, that does come with some costs, but the idea is that since you kind of cycle through different muscle groups, you can kind of make up for it over time, right? And again, maybe that leads to the same results you would have gotten from just taking a steadier approach, but maybe it does result in net more muscle growth. I'm not sure. Um, Definitely more to learn on this topic, but that's where my head's at right now with that question.
My next question is, why do you think, at least my interpretation is that it seems most people, when we're talking about this concept, talking about this study and looking to apply it, it is these chunk increases in volume. So do you think this is where we kind of come back to the whole adding sets conversation? Do you think that, you know, you take some of the, just purely from a face validity perspective, kind of seems like it would make a little more sense to kind of gradually add those sets over the course of a cycle. But obviously, that's not how this study is applying it. And generally speaking, that's not what we're talking about here. What do you think the pros and cons of each approach there are in terms of, okay, I've been doing this volume and I'm going to chunk increase it right away to this 20% increase? You're probably assuming people are going to intro weeks, things like that. I guess what I more so mean, instead of adding that 20% of volume maybe over the course of 3 weeks, what if we do it over the course of that entire, you know, 6 to 12 week cycle? What are your thoughts there?
I think you can go either way, and I've done either option. So just to make sure that's clear, basically, let's just say for simplicity that every single muscle group you're training is at 10 sets per week, and you decide to specialize pecs and quads, right? Um, Basically, in week one of that training cycle, do you put all your do you put pecs and quads up to 14 sets right away, or do you kind of slowly build up to that? Um, right, that option A would be to jump straight to 14 sets per week in week one. Option B would be maybe add 1 set per muscle per week, and then maybe restart the block and kind of cycle through that or something like that. Um, I've done either. I like to avoid a massive increase all at once, but it also kind of depends on the muscle group. Like, I'm not too worried if you add 5 to 10 sets of biceps in one week. Most people are going to be just fine. Whereas it might be different if it's something like hamstrings. I don't know if I have a good theoretical rationale for either one. I think they both kind of accomplish a similar thing. And I think this leads to a more general question that we just kind of need to understand to help us generalize this potential concept. And that is, what causes someone to no longer benefit from additional sets? Because if you're kind of in the camp of saying, let's just add a little bit each week and just push it as far as we can, um, I think that largely leans on your recovery capacity. The idea being that if you kind of gradually add sets, your recovery capacity is going to increase. And if you can recover from it, you can potentially grow from it. Whereas I think maybe a more conservative approach would be, or a more conservative, more conservative approach to specialization cycles would be like, yeah, we're just not kind of at the maximum point of our inverted U for that individual, but by if we kind of think about some of the practical considerations of high volume training for all muscle groups, um, we just can't be at the tip of the inverted U for every single person or for every single muscle group. So let's just kind of cycle through them one at a time. I'm not totally sure. Ultimately, I think it comes down to what causes someone to no longer benefit from additional sets.
Nice. Yeah. No, I don't really have an answer to that either. I think you made a really good point of like why do our additional sets helpful or not helpful, in the sense that some people think if you can recover from it, there's automatically going to be benefit. But I think there's a hidden premise there that you're also each additional set is also productive. There's like kind of two competing things there. Like the stimulus needs to be productive, and then you also need to be able to recover from just the training and the negative taxes that come along with performing that training. So I think there is a hidden premise there when people are like, yeah, just do as much training as you can recover from. I don't know if that actually is what we're after.
Yeah,
It's you can recover from something, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's additionally adaptive or productive in a
yeah,
positive sense. So I think that there could be differences between those two approaches that I'm not, like you said, I'm not really sure. And I think both of them at the moment seem totally fine in terms of practical applications. It's just the concept of, you know, cycling on and off
yeah.
that probably seems to be useful.
Yeah, I think that leads to a really important point, and one I've been thinking about a lot. And when I say the potential quote unquote practical benefits of specialization cycles, one someone that's maybe like super hardcore and like I'll do whatever it takes, brother, to get it done, to optimize my training, they might think that doesn't apply to them, but I think it does, because ultimately there's only so much productive training that an individual can do. Even if you can theoretically recover from it, even if you're training 6 times per week, and by the end of a 2-hour session, like you can't tell me that those sets at the very end are going to be just as productive as the sets at the beginning of the session. And the reason I've been thinking about that a lot is just thinking about how much people typically grow when they are part of a resistance training study. um, if you were to just kind of like cross sectionally take trained individuals, let's say someone that's been training for 5 years, right? Put them in a training study, they will, most people will grow, right? And they'll grow a pretty good amount. Let's say somewhere in the ballpark of 5 to 10% on average probably seems somewhat reasonable to expect to see. Like in this study, that was basically exactly what it was: 6.2% in one leg on average, and 9.9% in the other leg on average. Um, but that's just not what we typically see in practice, right? Like you can't expect to see 5 to 10% muscle growth every 8 weeks in practice. And so to me, the question is, why do people grow so well from studies? And I think it largely comes down to the focused effort that goes into being part of a resistance training study, right? Those researchers are trying to get you to grow so that they can actually analyze your response and hopefully detect or properly investigate any potential differences between the conditions or the groups or whatever they're investigating. Um, so my thinking recently has been like, how can we better kind of emulate the focus that we get from a resistance training study? And in a resistance training study, typically they're pretty simple protocols, right? And typically there will be very focused sets on the measured muscle groups, right? So in this study, it was leg press and leg extension. It's probably a lot simpler than the way a lot of people train quads in practice. And I don't recall if they mentioned it in this study, but typically, if they're doing upper body training in a lower body study, um, it's not super supervised, and it's probably done after the lower body work. And oftentimes they won't have a researcher counting every single rep for them and making sure they're properly training all the way to failure if that's what the protocol is. Um, so ultimately, I think we can get closer to that kind of focused effort that seems to be so helpful for subjects in a resistance training study by these specialization cycles, and being like, all right, we're gonna be really locked in. Like, yeah, I hope your quads still grow even though we're specializing arms this cycle, but let's do everything we can to make arms grow this cycle. Let's put them first in a session. Let's record some of those sets a little bit more. Let's really keep an eye on how you're progressing those week to week. And again, it seems to work really well. And I think it might just be from the attention and the focus that it receives as a result of we're specializing X muscle group this cycle. Um, and I just don't think that, if just from our experience collecting data and doing research in this area, I don't think that you could do the focused effort on the muscle groups that we've studied on every single muscle group, every single training cycle, right? And I think that that focus and that attention is finite, and it might to some degree require specialization cycles. And I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit too high on this topic right now because I'm really excited about it for a multitude of reasons. Um, but that's kind of been where my head's at, and a lot of a lot of my lifters will tell you I've been kind of prodding at them to let me know if they're interested in specializing things if that's not a strategy we've been doing recently, because I'm interested in continuing to kind of test this out.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. Obviously, the one thing I just want to mention, just because it's an obvious additional factor, and I know you know this, I just want to make sure it's said, is the training status of the participants in the studies is obviously not who we're generally looking to generalize these findings to. So expecting 5 to 10% growth in an 8 week period for you know natural bodybuilders that
But
are
they
competing
sometimes
for
are.
worlds. What do you mean?
Um, I mean, there's some studies with really well trained folks, um,
Hmm.
and subjectively from subjects we've collected data on, I think there's some really well trained folks that still grow pretty dang well and get
Right.
stronger at a faster clip than if you were to kind of, you know, it's one training cycle. Let's say you're able to do 4 or 5 training cycles in a year. If you were to multiply their results times 4 or 5, like that's just unrealistic progress for a calendar year. But it
Mhm.
is realistic, even for a well trained subject, in my experience, in research, to accomplish in 8 weeks. So I agree with you.
Yeah.
On
Yeah.
average, those numbers I'm giving, those figures I'm giving, are coming from um, people that probably aren't as well trained as the average listener here.
Yeah.
But I also think, like, I don't know, it's the holiday season right now. A lot of my lifters right now are doing the absolute best they can, but also realize they're traveling or they're seeing family, and maybe we're proactively saying, yes, this period of training might not be 100% optimal, and that's okay. Um, so, like, to some degree, you are kind of a little bit, a lot of lifters are often detrained at certain points throughout a calendar year. So anyway, I'm slightly pushing back, even though I totally agree with you.
Yeah, I think it's obviously that's like a whole nother conversation that like a study Josh and I have talked about 100 different times that needs to be done is just giving, a few different just general things that, we've had tons of replication, for example, high and low load training resulting in similar muscle growth, and just taking three different like tertiles of training status of individuals and seeing if things our interpretation of most evidence and why we think that research is generally pretty applicable, even for individuals that are considerably more trained than the average participant in a study, is that for the most part, it's probably just the magnitude of response that is different and not necessarily the directionality. So in this example, maybe the average quote unquote trained participant in a study is growing 5 to 10% in a study. In this study, the individualized volume group grew more than the non-individualized volume group. If we had very very well trained like elite bodybuilders in there, maybe you cut those percentage increases down considerably, but the overall directionality would generally be similar. I think that's the if I'm going to stand on one side of the fence, that's probably where I'm going to sit. Although, like I said, some research on that would be really really nice because I think that would help us, see how much of a limitation this really is. Because one thing I think people don't often take into account is something that you said, Josh, in terms of like making this research useful. Is that if we brought people that are super well trained into the lab and logistics only allow us to train them for 8 to 12 weeks or whatever, we probably aren't going to get a huge response, at least in the same magnitude, that doesn't allow for those differential, results to actually take hold. Where we have measurement error and things like that that kind of have that lower cap of things that we need to exceed to really be confident that there are actually differential things happening. So I think that's an instance where intermediates, those kind of very familiarized lifters to the things we're asking them to do, they know what training to failure it is, they know how to perform the lifts, they've been training for a couple of years and are serious about it. That's like the ideal participant in my mind because they allow for still a really robust training response, but they have gotten through that familiarization phase where those initial things need to happen before we can probably be looking at differential effects of minute changes to training protocol. So that's kind of an aside, but something I think is would be cool to have in the future. But back to this, I have another question in terms of this is primarily focused on muscle growth, and I think what the conversation we've had so far makes sense in terms of muscle growth stuff. But when you talk about applying this to specialization cycles for different lifts that you're trying to prioritize strength on, what does that look like? Does that look like using this as grounds to really try to drive hypertrophy in the strength limiter of that individual? Is that like the primary application you're talking about? Is it really increasing sets on the lift that we're trying to improve skill on? What does that look like? Do you periodize it? Because I would assume it'd be slightly different for strength than it would be for muscle growth.
Yeah, I would say I lean a little bit more into the microcycle design and exercise order side of specialization when it is on the strength side of things. Like, if someone's pushing squat training and deadlift training pretty hard simultaneously, those can conflict a little bit at times, kind of depending on the individual's positioning, their leverages, um, their strength limiters, as we've talked about as well. Sometimes they can kind of be synergistic for some folks, like if the hips seem to be limiting them in the squat, but often that's not the case, and there can be some influence on how recovered you go into your primary session, and that can, if that recovery isn't quite as high as it could otherwise be, if the other lift wasn't um, deprioritized, for lack of a better term, then you could theoretically get better results by being a little bit more recovered on that day. So that's the first thing I look at, is kind of optimizing microcycle design to get the specialized muscle group the kind of optimal setup. Primarily with that primary day, and any days where we're focused on strength skill and those heavy exposures, feeling as good as possible going into those days. Otherwise, from more of a periodization perspective, it would be really, really hammering the strength limiter with additional training volume, if again that's appropriate given the context of the that individual's recovery capacity and what we think they would benefit from. I don't think that blasting someone with volume in the short term is going to lead to short term spikes in top end strength, but I think that could set up things maybe later in a training cycle. So that would be the main tenets, is optimizing microcycle design for those strength slots specifically. And secondly, maybe earlier in a training cycle, or just before, we're really looking to peak strength, is really trying to kind of take a maximalist approach on hypertrophy work, targeting the strength limiter for the specialized movement. So if it's squat, early in the cycle, maybe pushing those belt squats and adding 20 to 40% on those, if we deem that a helpful exercise for that individual.
Sweet. Yeah, that makes total sense to me. That's kind of what I was thinking too. Like usually for strength, just taking advantage of the inherent benefits of kind of moving that into like a prioritized position and potentially de-emphasizing the other lift was going to result in a ton of benefits to training quality just from doing that. And because the volume strength relationship is probably not as strong as the hypertrophy one, I think it probably makes more sense to direct that early in a cycle to the strength limiter work, just like you said, and then maybe later in a cycle, just using those inherent advantages to allow the performance to be very much prioritized for the one movement. Then obviously you'd cycle through the different lifts over time. But my last question here that I think probably is the most important for this stuff is obviously when we go to apply this, especially this concept, in my opinion, is the most important over the long term, right? This isn't something that, specialization cycles inherently kind of talk about multiple. The graphic that you put in your article kind of gives that impression, right? You have cycle 1, cycle 2, and obviously that'd go cycle 3, 4, and you're kind of rotating back and forth between these lifts and muscle groups. And something we talk about all the time is that it's really cool to, use these concepts and write down on a piece of paper what I'm going to do in cycle 1 and cycle 2. But how does taking this approach kind of change the way that you view individualization? For a deprioritized muscle group, what is kind of your key performance indicator that you're looking to be a successful cycle when it's deprioritized? And how does that change when it is prioritized? What are you specifically looking at? And ultimately, how do you know? Let's just take an example. If I'm looking to prioritize my biceps, how do I know which lever to pull? Am I pulling the volume in the deprioritized block? Am I increasing it overall? Am I increasing in the specialization block? I have some thoughts, but I'd love to kind of hear your thought process first.
The short answer is I don't know. But I'll tell you what I do in practice here and what I think allows me to maybe get away with it, or at least still have decent confidence in terms of like, okay, this is a good general workload for this individual's bench press. So I'm individualizing their workload or individualizing their volume, but also I'm able to pull the trigger on bench press specialization and also feel like I'm benefiting from the specialization. So I would very rarely, um, on the outset of working with an individual, put them on a specialization approach. Step one is run some training cycles and try to figure out what workload seems to be ideal and what formulation of that workload, as we've spoken about on the show before, seems to lead to a really good outcome for that individual. And then you can use that as kind of your home base to some degree, right? Of course, you're always reevaluating it. It'll probably change throughout a training career, but someone that's a little bit on the lower volume side in year 3 of training probably isn't going to be on the other end of the spectrum in year 8. Um, so you kind of try to find that home base range of what seems to work best for them, and then you can kind of use that as your starting point going forward. And I have a hard time believing that if we found somewhere around 10 sets per week to be really good for this individual's squat training, kind of taking into account accessory work as well, that going to 12 or 14 sets, if we also deprioritize deadlift, is going to completely take them out of a range that works well for them. I could be wrong there, but in my experience, that hasn't been the case. Um, which leads me to some other interesting thoughts about individualization, because I think it also needs to be in the context of the entire training program, whereas most of the studies, we just isolate kind of one muscle group. But I'll put a pin in that and see what you think.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about this in a pretty formulaic way. At least that's how I was thinking about it. So to me, the first thing you need to define, and obviously different individuals could define this differently, which I think is part of the whole individualization thing, right? Is you're just trying to first, what is your goal in applying this intervention, right? Like Josh said, I think you don't go to this probably right away. It's just more moving parts than you kind of need. You usually start with the simplest iteration of a training program and only add complexity when necessary. And so let's say, we've, like Josh said, we kind of have these home base training variables for an individual, but we've deemed that, to me, the reason you would apply individual specialization cycles is there is indications that this individual could benefit from additional training on one of the muscle groups and or movements. However, time constraints or overall recovery capacity and or both don't allow that to be the case for everything at the same time. And so that's why we're applying this intervention in the first place. So that's part A. The second thing would be, okay, what is a successful outcome look like in each kind of stage? A, which would be deprioritization, and then B would be prioritization. And so then you would define those parameters in terms of like, what does a successful cycle look like for a deprioritized muscle group? You'd probably be happy for trained individuals for maintenance at least, and then maybe be happy with a little bit of slow climb if that happened. Maybe you would also be okay with a little bit of regression. Depends on the context, obviously, but huge decreases in strength or muscle size obviously is not what you're looking for. So that's kind of a successful outcome in a non-prioritized training phase. And so with that, you can individualize within that phase, right? So we can tweak and adjust training variables within the deprioritized phase for a different lift or muscle group to make sure that outcome happens. Now, when we switch to prioritization, obviously what we're looking for is a meaningful increase in the rate of progress relative to what we saw in the deprioritization phase. So the relative aspect of that to me is key because that kind of makes things relative to an individual's training age. We're not putting a number on it necessarily because in more advanced individuals probably not going to see a 10% increase in their squat every single time they do prioritization if they've been training it for a really long time, but a pretty decent change in the inflection point over a block or a couple blocks of prioritization is probably what you're looking for and for a successful outcome there. And so then once again, within that, if we saw successful strength maintenance or muscle size maintenance within the deprioritized block, if we're not seeing a pretty strong inflection point of improved progression when we do prioritize that muscle group or lift, probably want to make some adjustments there. And so to me, that's kind of how it works. And you're able to kind of treat the two things independently. And obviously you're looking at your overall kind of recovery and stuff that's more general as well. And so to me, you kind of have the deprioritization and prioritization variables for each lift and muscle group. And then if you add that into like a periodization framework as well, now you're just adding, one extra layer to it. So that's kind of what I was thinking, but I don't know if you think that's a foolish way of going about it.
No, I think that's a really good way to think about it, especially if you're going this route for the practical benefits that we talked about. Where I think things get tricky, and this is primarily why I'm just not sure yet, is the potential benefits of short term changes in training volume in isolation. So, in other words, like as we've talked about a ton, it seems that like kind of the ideal volume for each individual is probably different, right? Um, but now once you layer in the fact that short term changes in training volume might support hypertrophy independent of that absolute training volume, now things get tricky, right? Because is it a
Wouldn't that
short
be
term?
captured in the inflection point? Of like, if we take that volume load would be, a proxy of hypertrophy. Obviously it's not perfect, but relatively small repetition range, relatively set loading range, and same exercise. Do you not think that'd be captured in that kind of inflection point, in the sense that whatever volume you've landed on in terms of that prioritization, you're probably going to start somewhere around 20%. If that short-term change in training volume is actually effective for that individual, that should be evident in the
Right.
performance increases, right?
But how do you know if that new volume after that inflection point is actually just a better volume for them?
Yeah, I mean that would be kind of rung A to me. Like that's the very first thing, is determining whether the overall rate of progress. So this is kind of like
Hmm.
meta individualization now. So we just individualize the best specialization cycle for an individual we could construct. Let's say we tried it 3 different times, get the average rate of gain within that, and then you compare that to a non-specialized, overall training approach, training cycle for that same individual. Does specialization actually result in better adaptations with a similar overall volume, kind of
Right.
averaging the prioritization, the non-prioritization? So that's
Yeah.
like
It
that's
gets
some long-term stuff there.
yeah, I was just gonna say that's a that's really tough in practice
Yeah.
and especially in research because you'd have to do that for every muscle.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, yeah. But overall, I think I agree with that framework. I think that makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense. Um, would you disagree with kind of the way I explained doing it in practice? Like, would you add anything on to just the very general concept of find that sweet spot first and then just kind of use that as your home base? If you need to drop from that home base as needed to allow you to prioritize certain muscles,
Yeah.
cool, but otherwise keep it there, bump some stuff up here and there as you kind of feel like you could benefit from it.
Yeah, no, that's the part I find interesting. And actually, this conversation, I have my kind of running list of uh, takeaway topics, and I have one of them on there that was like talking about how low we can go for maintaining adaptations. And I think that might be what I do next, just kind of on the piggyback of this conversation, to kind of get both sides of the spectrum. And ultimately, why I think that's relevant is because if we can establish this really wide range of what seemingly is fine for an individual, I think the cost of performing this kind of an approach just decreases dramatically. And I already think it's extremely low, but I just think that would encourage people to give it a shot. And then like we talked about, if giving a shot obviously allows for comparisons to your past training. And I think if you're going to simplify everything, like you said, like just take what you're doing, maybe turn it into like a 2 block sequence where you split your body in half and kind of pair things that make sense. So like maybe you do, it's kind of hard. Maybe I thought through the practical implications of what muscle groups kind of pair well together. But let's just say you split it in half, and you kind of have a specialized block A, specialized block B, and then the opposite kind of deprioritizes. I think the costs of doing that are extremely low. And like you said, I think the inherent practical benefits of doing that are extremely high.
It's
Extremely
fun.
high. Yeah, I just think like I'm just thinking even when I haven't done that from like a programming perspective intentionally, sometimes it's like a verbal thing. in terms of like really hammering, like focusing on training quality of the accessory movements for a certain lift, focusing on load selection for top sets, focusing on execution. So it's more of like it's a intent thing rather than like a something that's on the paper. If you pair those two things together, I feel like that's going to be really,
Hmm.
really powerful. So yeah, I think ultimately, I think that's a really, really good way of doing it that has a really low amount of cost. And like you said, the thing that I'm the most interested in is obviously, it's kind of the bumper sticker coat that periodization doesn't matter for hypertrophy. But we've said for a while, the one area that I do think that has potential is nailing down what needs to happen for resensitization to occur to a significant enough degree that if we increase that rate of progress, it does allow us to get to a higher peak. And I think this is ultimately where it comes in, because nobody's going to come in and try to deprioritize every single muscle group. And this makes it so that you're taking advantage of the gained back training time that you have, and just makes everything more productive. Also allows you to take advantage of higher training volumes that generally aren't logistically feasible. A lot of people I think can get up to 30 sets a week for biceps, but doing that on top of really hard squat, bench, deadlift training is nearly impossible. Um, so I think that it just really makes sense, not only from a logistical perspective, but also from a very theoretical, mechanistic perspective that maybe slightly, potentially, terms and conditions apply, has some upside. I think it probably is kind of yeah, I think this conversation, just reading what you wrote, might have turned my mind to that being kind of a default approach once you're kind of there for hypertrophy training, um, because I don't really see a lot of downside, but I see
Yeah.
a whole lot of potential upside, for a variety of reasons, both
Yeah.
mechanistic, physiological, and psychological.
Yeah, this is going to be a hard one to study because I almost think the benefits are in the longer term, right? If you think about a training
Yeah,
year, because if you do a 12-week study with some sort of specialization approach, cycling through things, don't get me wrong, I think that'll be awesome. But I guess from a practical perspective, even if you did kind of a typical training study with like specialization approach versus kind of standard steady volumes, and they were the same, outcomes were similar. In practice, I might still go with the specialization approach because it wasn't worse. And also, I think there might be results that emerge in the long term. Just from, like you said, like knowing that you're specializing a muscle group and you have something you're working towards is really helpful. Like I see it in lifters all the time when they sign up for a meet and they know that's on the horizon, kind of the switch that's flipped. If we can kind of get that even a little bit by saying, yeah, we're doing all we can to grow this muscle group this cycle, I think that goes a long way. And again, circling back to what I said about the relatively robust increases in muscle size we see in research, I think it's because there's that high intent. Okay, I'm doing this study. I'm going to give it all I got, type of thing, and also having the accountability and the researchers there encouraging you and a good training environment, et cetera. If we can do that to some degree, I think good things could happen. And yeah, I mean, like if we think of the I think it's pronounced Ogasawara study, basically comparing continuous to periodic training. I want to say it was like 6 weeks of training on, 4 weeks of training off and kind of repeating that over like 6 months or so, and they ended up at the same spot um, for strength. I don't think the differences were statistically, or there were no significant differences in either strength or hypertrophy. So in their non-training weeks, they didn't train at all. Like I have a hard time believing there's no potential approach to this that would lead to net better gains, because what in biology doesn't desensitize as you repeatedly apply a stimulus, right? So if you can kind of leverage the desensitization to at least get to the same spot in a more fun way and potentially less time too, compare and potentially reaching a higher point. I think this is the thing that I'm most excited for in terms of periodization for hypertrophy. Obviously, that would have implications for strength as well. I think there's a lot of other things we could talk about. For example, whether we could get a similar effect by kind of changing training styles. We talked about drop sets in last podcast, um, blood flow restriction training. Um, from the periodization research we have, it doesn't seem like kind of changing rep ranges over the course of a uh, you know, 8 to 16 week study has a huge effect, but maybe it does emerge over the longer term, especially if you polarize it even more. You know, myo reps, different approaches to work capacity phases that we've talked about in previous episodes. I think there's a lot to learn, right, in terms of this resensitization concept that could have really big implications, and at the very least, get people to the same point with less time spent in the gym, potentially a more enjoyable approach, and best case scenario lead to better long term outcomes.
Yep, I think that's it, man.
Sweet.
Yeah, like we talked on the front end, if you enjoyed the show, go ahead and leave us a 5-star rating and review, and check out some of the links in the description if you want to leave a potential question for a future show as well. Didn't get to one this time, but maybe in a future episode we'll get another warm up question going here and start answering some of those. But yeah, without further ado, we'll see you next time, and thanks for tuning in.